In this module, you're going to learn about U.S. immigration policy and the various dimensions of the U.S. immigration policy debate in American politics. At first, why does this topic matter? And why is it that U.S. immigration policy sows so much discord in American politics? Well, the reason for this is because the United States has had a pretty relaxed immigration policy since the 1960s. The United States has become more diverse. So if you'll look here, 84% of the United States population in 1965 was white or Caucasian. In 2015, on the other hand, only 62% of the United States population was white or Caucasian, while 12% was African American and 18% was Hispanic in 2015. You'll also see that there was an increase in Asian Americans in 2015. So in other words, the United States is more heterogeneous or simply more ethnically diverse than other parts of the world are. And there are some people in this country that think that that's a good thing. There are other people in this country that think that that is a bad thing, right? To make this even more relevant to your own lives, I want to point out that most of you taking this class, if you live in the Riverside area, you live in the 41st Congressional District. You'll see here on this map that Riverside, Ontario, Moreno Valley, Lake Matthews, Paris are all included in the 41st Congressional District, which Mark Takano represents. Well, 25%, 1/4, 1 out of 4 people that live in this congressional district are foreign born. In other words, they are either illegal or legal immigrants living in the district, right? So I'm going to guess that every single one of you taking this class right now, you know a family member, you have a friend, or even you yourself, you were born somewhere else in the world rather than the United States. This is why we're devoting some extra time to immigration policy in this class, because I know that immigration policy is something that touches every single one of our lives in this class. So I want to talk about the various dimensions of the immigration policy debate. There are a bunch of different ways that we could talk about this issue and different questions that we may ask. So the first dimension of the immigration policy debate is this kind of moral imperative question. And this usually pertains to asylum seekers or refugees, right? So the question here is, does the United States have a responsibility to accept people into the United States, to allow people to migrate into the United States that are fleeing some form of violence or conflict in their home countries? Now, the United States has, in fact, accepted a large number of asylum seekers and refugees over the last couple decades. However, the current US-Mexico border crisis is partially or subsequently a result of many people coming from parts of Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and many of those individuals that are attempting to cross the US-Mexico border and are being held in detention centers for having done so illegally, they are not just attempting to migrate to the United States to improve their economic situation. They are claiming they are seeking asylum in the United States, which means that they are stating that if they return to their home country, they have a reason to fear for their lives. The way in which the United States government processes asylum seekers and their applications is different from how somebody may immigrate from the United States from an Asian country or maybe another part of Latin America, let's say Argentina, Brazil. So somebody immigrating here as a legal immigrant, the paperwork process, so on and so forth, looks very different from the process that you would go through if you were an asylum seeker. So the second question that comes up in debating immigration policy is this underlying question as to whether or not immigrants, both illegal and legal, have a net positive or a net negative impact on the economy. Those who believe that immigrants have a net positive impact on the economy would point out that a lot of illegal and legal immigrants have businesses here in the United States. They pay taxes. They are consumers. They purchase goods and commodities here in the United States. And so, despite the fact that they may use some social good services, like they send their kids to the public education system, or maybe they collect food stamps, they file for unemployment benefits, that still doesn't take out of the economy as much as illegal or legal immigrants put into the economy. Those who argue, though, that illegal immigrants or even legal immigrants have a net negative impact on the economy argue that these individuals use too many social goods and services and do not pay enough in taxes to make up for the amount that they are collecting in social goods and services. Okay, so this is actually an empirical question, unlike this moral imperative question, right, about asylum seekers. And the answer to this question is actually there's an answer to it, and the answer is that we know that illegal immigrants, for instance, as well as legal immigrants, have a net positive impact on the economy. You're going to read about that later on in this module in a little bit more depth. The third dimension of U.S. immigration policy is to what extent do we want the United States to look ethnically diverse, and to what extent would we prefer the United States to be ethnically homogenous? So we're not really going to dive into this question much in this module, but I just did want to point out that there are some people in this country who may argue that it's better that everybody kind of looks the same, that everybody speaks the same language, that everybody has the same ancestral lineage. Alternatively, there are a lot of people that would argue that diversity is good, that, you know, we get to share each other's food, each other's culture with one another. And inevitably, if you spend enough time in the United States, you become American more than you become anything else. So this is just more of a question of, like, to what extent is diversity versus unity desirable in a nation state? The last question that we have to ask is a more practical question. So after determining the answers to all of these questions, we still have a lot of different ideas as to what extent or exactly how we should manage the US-Mexico border or the US-Canadian border. For instance, when you think of immigration policy in the United States, I'm sure the first thing that comes to your mind is the Trump administration's child separation policy. That policy, set forth last year, dictated that when adults attempted to cross the US-Mexico border illegally with their children, that their children then should be separated from them when they are put in detention centers. So there are some practical questions here, like, is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? Does that even make sense? Should we use drones to monitor the US-Mexico border? Or should we attempt to stop people from crossing the US-Mexico border by detaining them for doing so illegally for months on end? Or is it better for us to utilize a catch and release policy? So the Obama administration was famous for its catch and release policy. If we catch you crossing the border illegally, well, we're not going to detain you. Instead, we are going to put you on a bus or a truck, and we're just going to send you back to where you came from, right? So this there's a lot of dimensions to US immigration policy. We're going to focus on in this module more this first question about, or I'm sorry, the second question about economics, and this last question, practical considerations. Before you dive into the content in the module, though, I want to demystify a bunch of things related to immigration in the United States. The first myth that we're oftentimes told is that illegal immigration in the United States is getting worse rather than better. That's not true. In fact, there are fewer illegal immigrants living in the United States than there were in the early 2000s. So approximately there are about 10 to 11 million illegal immigrants right now living in the United States, but that number was higher just a decade ago. The second myth that we hear sometimes is that illegal immigrants are not invested in their communities here in the United States. And so that's why, they shouldn't be here. But something important that I want you to know is the majority of illegal immigrants living in the United States have been in the US for more than 10 years. So this data is from a couple years old, but you can see that approximately 66% of illegal immigrants living in the United States in 2016 had been living in the United States for more than 10 years. So this tells us that their kids have grown up here, right? They own businesses here. Maybe they even own property here. This makes it really difficult to say, oh, let's just deport all of the illegal immigrants living in the United States, right? Another myth that we hear oftentimes is that the immigration policy in the United States is really a US-Mexico border issue. Specifically, most of the illegal immigrants here living in the United States are Hispanics. I want to point out that this is a measure of just numbers of immigrants living in the United States, or percentage of immigrants coming to the United States. So this includes illegal and legal immigrants. But Asians are actually projected to become the largest immigrant group in the United States over the next couple decades, rather than Hispanics. Another myth that I want to kind of do away with is the notion that most illegal immigrants living here in the United States crossed the border illegally between US, the United States, and Mexico. It turns out that the majority of illegal immigration currently, right, is a consequence of individuals overstaying their visas. So if you, for instance, you're an Australian national, you were born in Australia and you have Australian citizenship. Let's say you want to come to the United States and you want to work at Google for 6 months. Well, you have to get a visa. You get that visa for 6 months, you have to go back to Australia after that visa has expired. What a lot of people do is they don't return home. They stay here in the United States. And that is how most illegal immigration happens. Okay, not illegal border crossings between Mexico and the United States. The last thing that I want to demystify is this notion that illegal immigrants are dangerous and they are criminals and they pose a threat to our security. We have a bunch of research that's been published over the last couple years that shows that illegal and legal immigrants alike are 75% less likely to be incarcerated than native-born citizens of the United States. In addition to that, we also know that undocumented immigrants are less likely than native-born citizens to commit violent crimes. And lastly, we also know that sanctuary cities here in the United States, right, that promise to do their best to protect their illegal immigrant population, are actually statistically safer than cities that are not sanctuary cities. Okay, so now I've also put the researchers' last names and the date that all this information was published in case you want to check it out yourself. Okay, let me know if you guys have any questions about this content.